your love, something about your love changes everything, changes everything. Something about your love, something about your love changes everything, changes everything. Something about your love, something about your love changes everything. You turn my morning into dancing, you turn my morning into dancing. 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 Something about your love, something about your love changes everything.
Good morning, Rooted Men. Matt Ryan, Elder, Firmly Rooted Mysteries. Pleasure to be with you on this Friday morning. Back to the normal schedule, being with you on Friday instead of Wednesday. Happy to be with you this morning. As you can see, it's dark behind me, so yes, I'm cheating. I recorded this last night. But I'm still with you in spirit since I'll be on a call while this is being aired. So we'll continue working through Joshua, and it's kind of interesting studying Joshua in Lent at the same time. It's not a lot of real happy stories going on in Joshua. This kind of repeated theme of, obedience leads to victory, but it wasn't always pretty, certain at that time when they were warring with each other. And so we get into the reading, and Joshua said, "Open the mouth of the cave and bring those 5 kings out to me." So they brought the 5 kings out of the cave, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. When they had brought these kings to Joshua, he summoned all the men of Israel and said to the army commanders who had come with him, "Come here and put your feet on the necks of these kings." So they came forward and placed their feet on their necks. Joshua said to them, "Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Be strong and courageous. This is what the Lord will do to all the enemies you're going to fight." Then Joshua put the kings to death and exposed their bodies on 5 poles, and they were left hanging on the poles until evening. At sunset, Joshua gave the order, and they took them down from the poles and threw them into the cave where they had been hiding. At the mouth of the cave, they placed large rocks, which are there to this day. That day, Joshua took Makkedah. He put the city and its king to the sword and totally destroyed everyone in it. He left no survivors, and he did to the king of Makkedah as he had done to the king of Jericho. What a happy little story, right? It's like it feels like it's an episode of the Smurfs because it's so quaint and cheery. But we hear these stories over and over throughout the Old Testament, and there's so many different parts to it, right? So the theme of obedience, and obedience brings victory. We like to reference this model a lot of the warrior, right? The spiritual warrior. Obviously, we have the full armor of God, which comes in and out of this conversation quite a bit. You wonder, so many talk about struggling to hear God's voice in our lives today. I'm kind of glad that I'm not that likely to be called to be out there stepping on the throats of kings and putting their bodies on poles. I'm kind of glad we passed that part in history. So maybe the things we're called to do aren't quite as challenging, but they might be as unpleasant or as difficult for some of us, right? So understanding the faith and the obedience of Joshua, which again, Joshua just followed Moses, right? And so living in really nothing but faith and being obedient to faith, right? This is not an era of time where they saw Jesus and they lived with Jesus, and they don't have all that benefit of the new coming of the New Testament, of seeing it all come to fruition, right? This is the people living on faith from the stories of Genesis and Abraham and the oral histories. And so we talk a lot about stepping out in faith, and God will meet us there. And it's really amazing to read these stories where people really had to see that, to understand it, to live that example out so that we can learn from it. But what does it mean to step out in that military sense, to have the confidence to take and attempt to take cities that your army shouldn't be able to take. That every single reasonable observation in the world tells you there's no way. And all you got to go on is obedience. A little easier to get in their mindset, isn't it? Right? So God commanded Israel to conquer the promised land. And in this, we know that society after society, city after city tried to stand in the way of that, right? Doing what they could do to keep the promised land from becoming, progressed into. And so, we look at like the city of Makeda and these other 5 cities and their kings. It's something that just kept happening to the Israelites, right? Each of them trying to keep them out. And if you look at the pattern, each time there was obedience, there was victory, right? God always promised to be with them. It's pretty sobering to think of the line about this is what God will do to everyone who sins against him, right? How serious sin is, and the fate that it locks us into, and the hopelessness that is that sure death. Stepping on the throat is a pretty intimate way to die, I would say. Very violent. And that paints a pretty scary picture, right? We talked about this last night in Bible study, that we can feel so condemned when we realize how short we fall. But there's also power in realizing how short we fall, in that we are inherently broken and cannot do anything to fix it. We cannot earn grace. We cannot think our way through it. We can't understand it. We can't do all the things we've always thought we had to do to be a rugged individual, to do everything on our own, to be fiercely independent, all these things that make our country what it is. But they're all completely empty in reality if they're not done with God as part of them, if they're not done submitted to Christ, in understanding that I can do anything because of him, that I am free to live this life. I'm free to be independent because of him. So when we look at these lives of intense obedience, and we think about what it means to submit to that kind of thought pattern, that kind of truly hearing God's call over your life and never saying no, never believing you're not good enough because he made you good enough. He made you to do those things, and having the faith to go out and try to do them in the face of the high cost of disobedience. But we're not motivated because of that, right? We talked about it being fire insurance. We always use that term, right? I believe in God so that I don't go burn in hell. Well, that's not a very good reason, and I don't think you're really developing much of a relationship with him, right? It can be motivating to say I don't want to expose myself to that kind of fierceness, but really in the call to action, what there is that assurance of God's presence, like he was in Makeda, like he was in Jericho and all these other cities. He promised victory, and that unyielding faith of Joshua resulted in what you would say is, tangible manifestations of the promise, right? These things that really came true, the fruit that we all talk about. We desperately want to see the fruit growing in our lives, right? Literally, it was fruit to them. It was the land of milk and honey and produce, and the world produced for them, right? So what does it mean for us today? Because we're not fighting those kind of battles, right? Yes, we need to be wielding the sword of the Spirit, right? The word of God, as Paul puts it when he talks about the armor of God. The same way that Joshua yielded his physical sword, we need to be wielding the word, right? It doesn't mean it's to attack people with, but we know that the word of God pierces. The word of God separates joint and marrow, right? And now, of course, Tom always says this quote, and he'll be so bummed if he's listening because I can't remember it, but you know what I mean. The word of God has a way to cut right in, and we should be using it confidently, obediently, knowing that it's truth that needs to be shared as we're called to share it. So even when we're in battles, even when that battle is something we create in ourselves, when it's a condemnation of not being enough, whatever it is, we must still repeat and hold on to God's promises. The assurance that he's going to fight for you needs to give us the endurance to persist, knowing that this path leads to goodness, right? That faith and that obedience to live it out. So as we think about it, and here's where it ties into Lent, right? There's these 5 kings who are holding him back. Same idea in Lent. What are the spiritual kings in your life? Fear, doubt, sin, temptation. I don't know what it is that you're holding on to. But as we begin Lent and we reflect about God's faith and God's obedience, our obedience to his faith, called out because his promises are true and because he's faithful, what are the obstacles that are in our lives? We have the same God, the same promises, the same assurance that he's going to be with us, and the same promise of victory. So let today be the day that we fearlessly decide we're going to obey his word. We're going to change, because so often our way just doesn't work. That's where Lent can really be powerful, because we take it as a time of spiritual fasting, breaking free from the things that hold on to us, the obstacles we have in our lives, the things that are keeping us from God. Dig into his word, be encouraged, be obedient, and take decisive action. Right? I used to call it, when I was managing restaurants, we would call it Big Rock, right? I'm driving down the car in the windshield and there's all these rocks flying around, but the big ones are what's the biggest immediate threat, right? So I'm going to break the big rocks down into smaller ones, and eventually we'll work through the smaller ones. What's the big thing? You know, even if you deny it because it's uncomfortable, what are the things that are holding you back? And what would it look like to bring that to the foot of the cross as an act of faith and an act of obedience, because you know you've been told to, and to let go of it, to fast from it? Because ultimately this story is about victories, but not just won through might of the sword, but won through complete trust and obedience to God. Just like we talk about faith the size of a mustard seed, it's not the size of the faith, right? It's the size of the God that your faith is in. That's what won those battles. So I guess that's a challenge in a way. What's hindering you? What's holding you back? I know we're not necessarily in the process of giving things up for Lent, but what are some things you could use a fast from? I hope that's encouraging to you, man. I know that this is what we think about and talk about a lot at the beginning of Lent, but it's worth, I think, putting ourselves into that perspective as we go into each day. I love you, gentlemen. Let's take this word today and apply it. Let's live something out. Let's have a great day. Make it a firmly rooted day. And may someone see Jesus in us today.